actually, for quite some degree, the Israeli army might be responsible for the dead Israelis on October 7th.
Yes, and there are two reasons for this. One is the Israelis lacked the discipline and the training necessary to respond effectively to the hostage taking that Hamas carried out, which, by the way, was aimed primarily by Hamas at taking Israeli soldiers. The kibbutzim are garrisoned with soldiers. They are military settlements. Many of the people, the men there, some of the women, are in the Israeli reserves, and Hamas sought to take them as hostages. Undisciplined fire by helicopters with Hellfire missiles or by tanks with incendiary rounds directed at buildings is what happened. And this is a disgrace in military terms, and it adds to the diminution of the reputation the Israeli Defense Forces have had for military discipline and expertise. But the second reason is something called the Hannibal Directive. Yeah, so, and that is, given the fact that Israel has an enormous number of Palestinian hostages, people it has put in its prisons, often with no charges, sometimes with fake charges, sometimes with a genuine judicial process conducted by military courts. But it has a huge number of hostages, and many times in the past, Israeli hostages have been exchanged for Palestinian hostages in a vastly disproportionate ratio. So the Hannibal Directive basically says that rather than get into bargaining over a hostage exchange, you should just kill the Israeli hostages along with their captors. And that was also a factor here. But there's no question the participants in this outlandish music festival, just think for a moment, they're having a music festival on the border of a concentration camp. And the people in the concentration camp can hear and see what's going on. This is outlandish, to say the least. But to the people who were killed there were largely killed, it appears, by Hellfire missiles and by other undisciplined fire by Israeli forces who reacted in a chaotic manner to what had happened. And this brings me to a fundamental point. The Hamas had two objectives. One was to put the Palestinian self-determination issue back on the global agenda, and they have succeeded. There is widespread recognition, at least outside Israel, that only self-determination for Palestine in the form of a two-state solution can provide security to Israel and end the instability in the Holy Land. Many Israelis would disagree with what I've just said, but the fact is that their view is not accepted outside Israel for the most part. And even in my own country, which has a larger Jewish population than Israel, many Jews have come to realize that this is the case. Younger Jews, in particular, in the United States, I don't know about the Netherlands, but in the United States are very disillusioned with Zionism and don't want to be suffer contagion from it in the form of anti-Semitism, which is actually growing now as a result of Israeli actions. So I think one effect is Hamas's success in putting this issue back on the global agenda, in destroying the Abraham Accords approach of setting aside this issue of Palestinian self-determination. But it has also given Hamas enormous popularity among Palestinians because they are seen as having stood up, as having been willing to accept death rather than captivity. And this is where I'm grateful to Norman Finkelstein, who for bringing up the analogy of slave revolts in the United States. The 1831 revolt by Nat Turner, a well-educated, very intelligent, enslaved African, who led a slave revolt in Southern Virginia, and which had as its objective the murder of every white person they encountered. And they murdered some 60 white people, the majority also women and children, as in Gaza. This raises a moral question. Is the violence of the slave owner the same morally as the violence of a slave trying to end that violence? And the same moral issue arises with Israeli oppression of Palestinians versus Palestinian resistance to oppression. But as was the case in the Nat Turner revolt, the retaliation by American whites against American blacks was gravely disproportionate. At least 120 African Americans were lynched. Others were shot. There were mock trials, which were very unjust. And this is not remembered fondly by anybody in my country at present. And I don't think what Israel is doing in Gaza will be remembered fondly by anyone in future. When people think of Israel in the past, they thought of it as a refuge for the victims of the Holocaust, victims of Central European, I'm sorry to say not exclusively German, anti-Semitism. And now they will think of it as the home of perpetrators of genocide. And when they think of Israel, they will think of burnt buildings and dead babies. So this is an image problem of a fundamental nature. And from the point of view of Israel, it strips Israel of its protection by charges of anti-Semitism against anyone who is critical of Israel, because to be critical of people who are carrying out genocide cannot be anti-Semitism. It cannot be considered immoral. Anti-Semitism is a despicable attitude, but to oppose genocide by Israel is not.